Hey everybody, if you're listening in, this is Luke and I'm here to discuss optimizing your Tableau workbook. You've probably created some sort of solution, some sort of dashboard, and it might not be performing perfectly, but this session is actually here to show you how to find different ways to improve the overall performance of that dashboard. And I'll just, start and give a little hint to today's session. There is no single fix that's going to solve a problem. It's usually a series of steps that you need to take to solve that problem. But before we jump in, I do want to talk a little bit about myself. So I am Luke Stanke. I am a two-time Tableau Zen master. I've been using Tableau since 2013. I actually have used it before then. I evaluated the product, said no, it wasn't for us, and then had to make maps back in 2013. I worked for Minneapolis Public Schools and thought, how can we visualize data on a map? And Tableau was the perfect solution. I also co-lead Workout Wednesday, where we present a weekly business-like problem and allow users to recreate that challenge. I blog on our Tessellation Tech blog, tessellationtech.io/articles, and you can read near weekly blogs that we are putting out as a team. And then you can also watch our videos on youtube.com/datacoach. As part of our Tessellation products, we have a learning suite called Data Coach, and we place all our learning videos on Data Coach on YouTube. And just a little bit about my own evolution is that when I started in Tableau, I actually was embedding visualizations. My very first Tableau public visualization is in the top left corner here, and it's ACT scores by race and ethnicity with a little drop down. And I was already thinking about how to design really simple but effective visualizations telling that story. My background, it comes with some data science background. Evolved my own learning to focus more on how can I use advanced chart types inside of Tableau. So you'll see that I was downloading data from the StubHub and trying to figure out when the best price tickets are. If you look in June on the left side, there's a little calendar and you can see the red. That's New York Yankee tickets. They were the hottest priced tickets. Those were the best tickets. And then right above that, a couple weeks earlier is TB. If it's really hard to see, that's Tampa Bay. They're the champs this year. Being able, or at least in the AL, being able to call that out. And I could do really cool things. So then I moved on to quantifying Harry Potter. But more recently, the far right you'll see here is I'm working with tables and thinking, how could I design really cool tables in Tableau? Things that look like tables but are not really quite tables. So we've already talked about a bunch of this information already, but what I'm here to talk today about is building performant workbooks. How do you do that? As I alluded to, I already had said there is no single solution. Really, a performant workbook or really a workbook that is slow is actually a series of missteps along the way. And our job in rebuilding a performant workbook is to put the Jenga pieces back in to pick up back the speed. So there again, not one thing is going to cause this. It's actually caused by a number of different factors. And just to restate, the most important point to all of this and why it's so important is because our performant workbooks, they are faster. That allows our users to make faster decisions. They'd rather not sit for 20 seconds. I'm sure that there are some use cases where, our audience doesn't care if it's 20 seconds or 2 minutes. It's still faster than what they were getting. But if we're talking about our modern day users, they're like, give me the information now, and really under 3 or under 5 seconds. And that's why building performance dashboards matters, because they want to make decisions faster. It's going to make that experience better. And then frankly, the adoption in being able to get insights back in just a few seconds rather than a few minutes is going to increase adoption. And frankly, if you're sharing that information back and forth, it's going to make it way easier to collaborate if you're not having to wait several minutes when talking about a particular point, or even developing with a peer and having to wait a few minutes to talk about a particular point. And frankly, why does it matter? Because we all just hate waiting. That's really what it comes down to. We're a very impatient society at this point. We've got our social media, we've got all of the technology in front of us. Why can't our BI tools provide that same level of insight? And really, when we're talking about Tableau and how we can fix performance, well, it's degraded several ways. It could be on the server hardware, the actual hardware behind it. It could be in the configuration setup. Those are some things as an analyst you can't really control, but there are some small things that you can do on that point that work in your favor. Performance can be degraded based on the type of data source you're using. Is it a Tableau extract and maybe your Tableau instance is slow? Or is it a live connection and maybe your live connection and your data source hardware? Again, things that aren't normally controlled by you might actually be the cause of the issue. Those things we can sort out along the way, no doubt. But often it comes down to the last 4 points that we have here. It's your query to your data source. You're thinking, Luke, how do I control the query to my data source? It could mean you have a custom SQL connection that you need to adjust and use the whole data and bring it all in. Tableau likes and favors that. Or frankly, it could just be the number of calls that you have to make. And we'll talk a little about what that means in this session. It could be the complexity of your calculations. Frankly, if you're using nested table calculations or nested level of detail calculations, that can also be causing problems. Sometimes there's nothing we can do to get around that, but there are still workarounds even with the complexity of our calculations. And then, frankly, the number of filters that you have, the volume and the types of filters, that matters too, because the number of filters you have, frankly, comes back to your data source question. Again, we'll tackle that down the line, but the last point being now here is the number of marks you actually have to render on your visualization. If it's a lot of points, it's going to take longer to render than if it's just a single point. That comes back to the number of points being queried back from your original data source or rendered back from it. So that's really what it comes down to, is that how many points do you have to make and where does that data have to be made along the way. So again, server hardware, server configuration, things you probably can't control. The rest is in your control, or mostly in your control when it comes down to it. So where should you begin? Number one, start by using performance recording. It's really easy to set up. I'm actually going to show you in a second. But if you go to your help menu on any of your workbooks, you go down to settings and performance, and then you select performance recording. That'll actually allow you to interact with your workbook and find out. Tableau is going to record every moment, and then you can figure out as you work through your workbook and click around and act like you're an end user. Tableau is going to record the time it takes to process and where it takes to process. And ultimately, after you go back and you've done that and you've walked through like you're an end user, and then you choose start performance recording again, it'll actually stop performance recording. Tableau is going to create a workbook for you, and it's going to compile all of the points together and show you the timeline of what you've done and where things are slow. So if I look at my performance summary here, I actually have issues with my compile query, which is back to my data source and how it's actually grabbing that information. And I could click into any one of these particular values and see exactly what's happening and the underlying SQL that's associated with it. If you can, check the performance recording. That's actually going to help to start to distinguish, is it a data source? Is it the rendering? Is it the calculations? All of that sort of can be broken out to begin with via performance recording. And if you don't have that and you really want to get technical, you can always check the logs. The logs are available in your My Tableau repository under logs. It actually logs every individual bit of information that you're interacting with in your workbook. It is truly the history of what you've done. And if you ever have any issues and you actually have to go to Tableau, they're probably going to say, can you send me your logs? And your logs are going to tell you everything. So that's where you can begin. But frankly, if you're just going to start looking for those quick tips, kind of skip all the diagnostics. Let's just show you those tips. And we'll start with server. Again, you're going to think server, not much you can do. While your server admins have a host of tuning options, you can actually do things too. Frankly, it starts with the choosing of your dashboard size. And that is really important because when you choose the right size dashboard, frankly, using a fixed size dashboard, it will render for you and then it caches on Tableau Server. So then the next person that goes and looks at it, if it's within the appropriate time span, they don't have to have that render time. It's automatically done for you. If you use automatic, which is just going to size based on any one screen, not every screen is the exact same. So Tableau's render and cache is probably not going to work for everybody else. So it's going to slow down their render time. So it's like you're helping your friends when you use a fixed size dashboard. Everybody's helping each other if that dashboard is used across the board by a number of people. So you're helping your friends. And I also want to just call out that if you're not using content on the server, just delete it. If you clean it up, it's going to take up less capacity on the Tableau server, and it's going to improve performance just that little bit for everyone. So do your admin a favor, clean up your own work, keep it tight, and it'll help performance overall for everyone. So that's things you can do as a developer on server. What can you do with your data sources? First of all, one of the most important questions that always comes up, should you use live or should you use a Tableau extract? Tableau extracts are hyper tuned for Tableau to use, and they generally are the better option, but it really depends on the infrastructure. If you have a really great infrastructure set up for a live data source, if you're using Snowflake or whatever source it is, and you have that infrastructure set up, live might be the better choice for you. But the truth of it all is the answer is almost always use an extract. The extract is going to provide better performance. It's tuned for Tableau. And some people are going to try to use a live data source to reduce capacity on their Tableau server in many ways, but again, extract is the answer. Also on your data source, just remember this point, is that every visualization you put on a dashboard is going to query your data at least one time. If you have one sheet for one dashboard, you have one query. If you have, say, 60 sheets, you're stitching things together, that could have up to 60 queries in your data source because every viz is going to attempt to perform at least one query. Now, Tableau can get smart and see, oh, this visualization had all the same dimensions and this one measure, and this visualization had all the same dimensions and a different measure. Maybe we can combine those together. But for the most part, they're going to be treated separately, and that's going to take longer to run. Just think, you send one off to your data source and it has to come back and send off another and back and forth and back and forth. If you have 60 sheets, that's 60 back and forth. If you have 2 or 4, that's only 2 or 4 back and forth. So just when you're doing this, just ask yourself, how many sheets do you have in your visualization? Are they asking, what data are they specifically asking for? Do you see commonalities across them where they're the exact same, the same dimensions in your data? If they are, just turn it into one sheet. It'll help with the render time. If it's a completely unique view, ask yourself, how many unique views do you have? Do you have more than a dozen? Then you're probably thinking, and you should really consider redoing your dashboard and maybe having a second level down that's more detailed to that, so you don't have to render all that information back to that original data source. And I just also want to call out that if you include any values on your filters, Tableau has to call back all the different combinations on those filters. If it's an extract or if it's not a live, it's got to actually use those in the detail. So it's actually going to call out for all that data and bring it all back into Tableau, and then it's going to get filtered. The challenge there is that you're bringing and getting more data than is actually necessary for your visualization. So if you can remove filters, remove them when you can, particularly with dimensions, it's really going to help out. So here, just take a look at this visualization I have here. I have quite a few dimensions on rows. We can survive with that, but then I'm also adding in filters for subcategories, segment, customer name, city, state, region. I have so many filters, and this is already a detailed view. If I don't really need them, I should find a way to pull these off what I don't need. It's just it's not necessary. And I also want to just call out that I have a lot of information on my tooltips. Maybe I just as much on filters, on tooltips, remove those things that aren't necessary, that aren't providing value. And it is my firm belief that tooltips are a secondary or tertiary part of all of our analysis. You shouldn't hide any insights in a tooltip. They're not always intuitive for your audience. They're not always going to know it's there unless you're calling it out and have built a habit. But I would just say, pull that information out, put it on a separate sheet, different dashboard somewhere that you can drill into. So there you have it. Again, clean up your detail, clean up your filters, and then when it comes to your data source, another suggestion of what you can do is create that extract and roll up your data. Roll it up to the visible dimensions. Those are, again, extracting your data is a great way to speed things up. If you are using a custom SQL query in the actual bringing in of your data source, it's fine. It could work, but just know that there's two sort of SQL queries, a group by or order by, that are often a little bit slower. What you should do is create an intermediate table, right? You're aggregating data up for Tableau. Instead, create that in wherever your SQL source exists in that data warehouse, and then load that separate table into Tableau and do a join to whatever your main data source is from there. I'd rather bring in a series of small tables that are the entire data source and do my joins in Tableau than to all do it in a single SQL query on the outside. Or at least, if you're going to have a custom SQL query, build a table from that query and then just connect to it. It'll save steps and it'll improve the overall efficiency of your data source in Tableau. And just remember, if you do have data source that is too large, that's where there's this option that says aggregate visible dimensions. You might want to select that. It'll roll the data up to whatever level that you're going to select. And remember that if you're not using just a sum on that, you're going to want to note what you're going to have to weight your values on. So if you're going to take an average, it's going to have to be a weighted value. And you just have to note what those weights are. Again, always pay attention to those dates, but that is a great way to reduce the number of rows and increase overall performance on your data source itself. Let's move from data source now. Those are things that will significantly improve performance, by the way. Focusing on your data source goes so far, but sometimes when you're doing dynamic analysis, it's going to be based on a calculation, and that's where you're going to spend a lot of your time. Tableau has functions that already exist that are better than calculations. If you're working with groups or sets, bins, custom dates, formatting, I'm going to show you all of these and go live into Tableau and actually show you the differences. And while they're just small things, that actually will improve performance overall in many different ways. So I'm just going to go into my data source that I have here, and I'm going to show you some options. So when working with groups, sometimes one thing I see is that people avoid using groups and they're like, you know what, I want to group these values together, and they end up creating a custom calculation. This is a shorter version of everything that could be done, but I'll just say everything that contains 3D systems, let's group that by 3D systems. Everything with 3M in the name, let's call it 3M. If it's got ACO, I'll put it as ACO, Acme, and then could go all the way down the line. Instead of using that, I would suggest using a group. It's much more performant. Notice I have 3D systems, 3M, ACO, AccuHide, all those groups. I'm just manually grouping them. It might take longer, but performance will be significantly better than having to create that calculation. Another one, I've just made a video on this. I was exploring it and I was like, always, when I created my bins, the way that I did it was via calculation. And I just never believed that bins could be very performant. And I've definitely seen this in the real world where individuals are like, all right, if it's less than, the sum of sales is less than 100, let's bin 0 to 100 together. If it's 0 to 200, let's bin 100 all the way through and manually do this entire process. There is, of course, a faster, better calculation rather than using an if statement to do that process, where I could wrap this in floor and it's returns those values. Either way, this two-step calculation for each of these involving level of detail calculation. And the fact that I have to do this aggregation and then a level of detail calculation is much slower than just choosing an actual bin option. So I can just, instead, I've got these calculations, I can create the bins instead of having to do it with calcs, do it via this measure. And I have, again, broken out sales by order ID into a bin. And Tableau does this all better and faster than I could by writing the custom calculation. With custom date fields, that's one of another secret way to improve performance. We work with dates all the time in Tableau. And what happens when we build a visualization with dates is you'll notice that Tableau brings out onto our visualization this hierarchy. And this hierarchy is actually, it's great for our end users because they have the ability to press plus and click in further and further into the data. However, it is not the most optimal calculation, both the hierarchy itself and the calculation. Just to give you a sense, right, this calculation of year actually has an underlying calculation to it. So frankly, you could avoid using year and use the date part. We'll talk about that in a second. But the other part, to actually create a custom date, you just go and get rid of the hierarchy. You just click this drop down, choose create, and then choose from there. Let's try this again. I'll choose the actual order date this time, and we'll choose create custom date. And this will allow us to specify a single field. So we're just going to say years of date value and click OK. And now if I drag this value up as well, you'll notice that I no longer have my hierarchy and I actually have the same values being returned. And that is a much more performant, faster way than actually building the calculation that's associated with it, which is that date value of year. We didn't go into it too much because I'm going to save and talk a little bit more about it in a second. One of my favorite things that I often see mistakes on, by the way, is, let's just make sure that, formatting. Yes, with formatting is that people will try to build dynamic visualizations. And what they'll do is they try to put it all on a single label. I have this visualization. It shows profit ratio at this point via this drop down by month of the year. And then I could change that visualization to maybe show sales. It's dynamic. It's a single visualization. One's a percentage and one's a dollar amount. And that presents itself a very unique challenge for the label. It's and formatting the label. This calculation that I've written is not an easy one. Sorry, I picked the wrong one. Let's go to Axis Label and look at it. So if we look at it, I've got one that's helping me format to a percentage, and then I've got another that's adding in the labels based on the dollar amount. How large is that dollar amount? This calculation is a headache, and it's not performant. The better option, if you're really going to go about doing this, is to create two separate labels that are on the base calculation. You'll notice this one is the axis label for percentage, and my drop down, which is a parameter of choose type when it's profit ratio, then I'm just going to return the profit ratio value. And what I have to do here is just format this number. I go to default properties and choose number format, and I can change this to a percentage. And I can click and drag this value onto labels, and you'll see nothing has changed, exact same. And now when I go to sales, the labels are gone. We're just going to create a separate calculation for when we want dollar amounts to be returned. So I'm just going to say axis label. When that choose type is sales, we'll return the sum of sales. I'll hit OK. Of course, I'll do the same formatting, and I'll add that to label as well. And there we have the other label. So it's two different calculations. If you're like, Luke, you told me to avoid adding unnecessary measures and dimensions. This one actually works in our favor because it's at the same level of detail, the same dimensions are being shown. This is a single query coming back for sales and the profit ratio simultaneously. A really nice little trick for formatting is not to build that custom formatting calculation, but rather treat it as separate calculations. And I'll actually do this sometimes when I do a negative value. I want the negative value to be red and look completely different. So let's just work that one out. Let's do this live. Like I want this negative 18.1 to come back differently. What I'll do is I'll actually create and duplicate these really quickly. Let's just duplicate these percentages. I'm just going to edit one here, and I'm going to go edit, and let's just say when, and I'm going to do something not great, as we'll find out. I'll say if profit ratio is greater than 0, then profit ratio. And this is just going to return profit ratio when it's positive. I'm just going to quickly copy this in. I'm just going to put a plus. Just plus, there it is. So it's be formatted as a percentage and it's positive. I'm going to add this to label. I'm going to drop this first one, and then I'm going to edit this second option here. I'm going to paste it in, and I'm going to change this to negative. And we'll just say, actually, if it's less than or equal to 0 in this case, because we'll want to include 0 in case it does happen. We'll hit OK. Let's click and drag this onto label. Our negative label comes in. Let's change the color of that label. Now I'm just going to click the 3 dots, and out is going to come my 3 labels here. And I'm just going to put them all on the same line. And for that negative value, I'm just going to change it to red. And now when I bring that out, you'll notice my value is red here. The same is with this one. Tableau has just overlapped it for whatever reason, but all those negative values are indeed red returning, which is really cool. That's how I do my formatting. Again, rather than trying to do it custom, we're doing it via a single calculation with no problems. The last one that I want to really bring up here is aliases. Sometimes in our data source, it looks different than what we want to show. And what I see a lot of people do is they're like, you know what, Luke, in my data source, in my base data source, I have these subcategories. We have one called machines. We no longer call it machines. What we call it is electronics. So what they do is they create a separate calculation. So let's just look at this. Subcategory new is our new subcategories. We're just going to say if subcategory equals machines, then electronics, else subcategory. You shouldn't do it this way. The easier way to do this is, instead of using a custom calculation, is to right click and add an alias and change machines in the alias to electronics. Electronics. There we go. And that is the way that you should do it to improve performance. A tiny performance improvement nonetheless, but it is a huge one that is absolutely possible. So choose alias versus using a new dimension. Another very common, and I'm guilty of this next one personally, is that you need to simplify your logical statements that you use, particularly for filters. And I'll show you what I mean. Sometimes in my data, let's imagine I have this thing called category. It's a dimension in my data, and I set it to technology. I used to use then show, else hide. That's great, and then I can put that on filters, and then I just choose show instead of hide. But in reality, I've added a step in there. I've added the step where I could have just said category is equal to technology, put it on filters and selected true, and I would just return the same values. I've added an if statement. This one little if statement. Again, we're talking about the Jenga puzzle. I've added one extra processing step along the way to really cause things to go maybe a little bit slower on that one step. And they all just add up, one mistake after another. Another common one I see, and this is just one example, is considering, can I get away with just putting a parameter in a calculation rather than writing a case statement? So here's a really good example, right? I've got this case statement. It says I can choose the period, and it aggregates my data up to whatever level I want. So if I choose day, it rolls up to day. If I choose week, it rolls up to week with the day trunk function. If I choose month, it rolls to month, quarter to quarter, and year to year. Guess what you could have done? Rather than having this case statement run and then run through, do the case statement, then run the date trunk, you could actually just take period and put it right in the date trunk function. And again, I'm saving a step. Sometimes you just have to think through, can I save a step along the way? The next one I want to call out is, I don't have an example created for it, but sometimes when you write an if statement, you have overlapping logic that doesn't need to be run through again. So I might say, if my category is equal to technology, then let's do an action. Else if my category is equal to technology, or if it's equal to home office, or whatever it is, then do something. Well, that technology was already covered in the first step, so why am I running it redundantly over the same information when it's not going to do anything? That'll slow down performance. So avoid overlapping logic in your statements. There's a lot of things you can actually do with your if statements, and there's really two things that I think about. And this is actually probably, to me, the most important, is avoiding putting aggregations inside of your if or case statements. And this often will look like, and maybe I have an example of it. Yeah, let's just hop into Tableau. I don't know if I actually prepared an example for this one, so we're just going to create one on the fly here. And what I mean by that is what I'll see is something like this exact calculation, right? I want to return the sum of sales if my category is technology. And what I'll often see is if category is equal to technology, then sum of sales. End. This is going to be broken, but what people do is they put ATTR, an attribute, and this rolls it up, and you're like, oh, this works just fine. What we've done is we have two aggregations here. If we look at it, right, if we just look at these two functions, we have an aggregation on category that we need to do, and an aggregation on sales to return a pre-aggregated sales. Instead of doing an aggregation this way, what I highly suggest, keeping it as row level as long as possible, is to do if if category is equal to technology, then sales. And if you really need to wrap this in an aggregation, then you can take this whole thing and wrap it in sum along the way, and you can have that value returned in a much more performant way. Again, keep it row level as long as possible. And this is an example of how you can actually do that. Another one thing that I saw, and we just looked at it, is you can't avoid, there's some situations in which you have to use an aggregation. And what I see people use is the ATTR function. I even showed in my example how it was done. But know that the ATTR function is actually less performant than just using min or max. So instead, if I really had to get away with it, instead of saying if ATTR category equals technology, then sum of sales, what I would say is try to see if you can't use min. And the reason I say that is because if you look at the underlying calculation for ATTR, it actually involves both the min and the max calculation twice over for whatever that dimension is. So do yourself a favor and take out your ATTRs and use min. It's such an easy solution that you can really speed up your dashboards. This is like one of my go-to solutions, is I'll just drop ATTR on everything, and it speeds things up. I also want to call out, with your calculations, if you're working with a lot of dates, choose to use date trunc, date name, or date part instead of the year or month calculation, because Tableau has to do that conversion for you. It's better that you explicitly specify that. And what I mean is if I come over into Tableau once again, and I just, let's do a quick search, and we'll build out a date field. If we just take order date once again, I'll place it on my columns, and maybe I'll just change this to month. If I double click Tableau, it says month of order date up here, but if I double click, you can actually see the underlying calculation. Tableau's converting it for us. Why don't we just explicitly state it when we build a calculation? So instead, if we're going to build a month calculation, use date part instead of, the other option here was month of order date. Use the top line, don't use the bottom line. They're both going to produce the same thing, but we've added in one more step. Get rid of it. Easy solution. Potpourri on a few things is if you're doing text search, there's two functions that you can use. One is contains, one is find. Use contains over find. It's a faster way to do it. If you have to absolutely find, I'm not going to get into the details of it because it's rarely used. I personally use contains a little bit. Oh, and just one more call out in the newer versions. In addition to contains, there is an operator called in. If you have a newer version, 2020.3 or newer, you can use the in operator. It works just as fast, if not faster, than contains. And the second point here is use count distinct sparingly. What I mean by that is that if you use a count distinct, Tableau needs to render that particular dimension in its aggregation. So if you're thinking like, hey, I'm going to run a count distinct of number of customers, Tableau has to go get that count distinct. It has to actually create the dimension of customers and then run the total. Well, it might return as a single number. That query back to the data set is going to be slow. So the more count distinct you have on a particular single visualization, the slower it's going to be. If you want to really slow down a visualization, do count distinct of every possible dimension, and Tableau is going to have a really slow visualization. The last potpourri mention here is nesting LODs and table calculations. Try to avoid it. Sometimes it's impossible. You're like, I've just got to roll all these numbers up and they need to be dynamic. One solution is to try to put it as a new row in your database. So you have new column in your data source so that you don't have to run these dynamic calculations with nested calcs that are running slow. If possible, that's one solution. Just know that sometimes I find myself doing 2-level, 3-level LODs. They work okay, but they do slow things down. If I get to a 3-level table calculation, I can guarantee performance has slowed significantly. And that actually has to do with where the calculation is executed. With table calculations, they happen on the last step, which is called the render step. This is after all the data has been loaded in Tableau. All the processing happens on Tableau Server on this render function. And usually that's the weakest step. With level of detail calculations, it happens earlier in the data source, but just if you're nesting enough of it, even if your data source is pretty fast, it will still cause extra calls to your data. I don't want to get into it too much because we are certainly limited with time. I feel like I missed a few if statements, so I do want to cover those off really quickly. I'm going to hop back into Tableau, and there's 2 if statements that I really want to call out. Number one, is that if you're working with an if statement, is to always call the most relevant information in your if statement first. This is a count distinct of the number of rows in my data by state. If I were going to use an if statement, the last thing I would want to do here is say if state is equal to New Hampshire, the last state on my list, then and let's just add color to it. We'll call it green. Else red. What this is going to do, if I render this, let's just call this state color. And I'm going to hit apply. I'm going to go search for it. Let's put it on our viz. State color. What this is going to do is it's going to run New Hampshire for this tiny number of records first and then run it for everything else. What I should do instead, if it's a smaller value, New Hampshire representing a lot less states, I should put it second in my call. So sometimes this means saying if the state is not equal to New Hampshire, let's make that red. I know my color is a little off here, and then else green. So I'll just hit apply. Nothing's going to change on my actual visualization, but the underlying calculation has changed completely. So hit apply, changes my calculation. But this is going to render server on your visualization faster because you want to pick the more common values earlier. The other one I really want to call out is nesting your if statements. I have a really great example here of 2 different ways to do it. I've got the wrong way, which I have it shown here. So let's just take a look at that. It's just called nested if and then bar no. What I've done is I've nested my if statement. I said, if subcategory is equal to office supplies, and then let's check year is equal to 2018, then return red, else return gray. And if they're both that, then we return the colors here. And they're not red or gray, but you get to my point, is that I'm separating them out, I'm nesting it. The other alternative, if we look at the calculation, is very simple. I just use an and statement. I say, if category is office supplies and year is 2018, then red, else gray. So let's hop into the next section, filters. And I've called out a number of key points here. And I'm going to start to do a speed round because we're certainly long-winded at this point, and I want to cover off as much as I can. If you have the same filter across every sheet, you should absolutely use an extract filter. Put that into the extract. You don't need that coming through on your visualization at all. And the next part is if your filters are taking 10 seconds with every click, right? If you're on your visualization, you're saying, all right, I have this visual. Let's see if I've got a sheet somewhere that I've put this together. Every time I click, it's taking a long time to load. Instead, use the option in here of apply to uncustomize, show apply button. Use that apply button. And this way you can make a bunch of changes, wait, and then hit apply, and it runs all at once rather than having to run through each time. Do context filters really increase speed? This used to be a common go-to for Tableau. If your dashboard's slow, throw things on context filters and it will speed up the performance. More or less, the answer is not really anymore. Like, that doesn't work. Tableau's changed fundamentally how they work. That's not to say that you still can't get some performance boost occasionally from it, but for the most part, there's no rhyme or reason or set in stone reason why it would work. Generally, what I find is, and this is just anecdotal, about half of my values on context filters and half on standard filters work. But I'm more concerned about getting my order of operations correct with my filters than I am playing with context filters to really increase speed. And if you're at that point, if you're at this point trying to figure out what filters to put where, go find some other things to go improve performance on. There's also another option in here, which is really typical of seeing people use, which is this drop down of show only relevant values. So when I select this here, we're going to lose some cities. They're only relevant because they're showing up in the data source. That'll actually slow down performance because it has to send a separate query to your data source to see, okay, I'm going to apply these filters. What values should I see? So it will slow down performance slightly. Again, if you're looking for perfect performance gains, it's one thing to consider. And then if you're having to use today or now, date is less than today or date is less than now, try to find a different way to include that. Include a filter at the data source level, maybe, that is returning this before it comes into Tableau, into your extract. Today and now are just slow. And especially if you're going to put it into a filter, you're talking about slowing things down. And if your dates are really slow as parameters, right, you have a single date filter that's on your data source, another option is to load those dates into a parameter and then say, if that date parameter is equal to that date field, put that on filters and use that for filtering. You will see performance gains because, frankly, dates are the slowest type of field in your data source. You want to avoid using them in general on filters or having it too many places on your view, just because it's the underlying data for a date is more complicated than most. Marks. The last section is the actual rendering of your visualization. Everything else is actually being prepared along the way. What are we going to see? I think the easiest thing to say is try to minimize the number of marks that you're going to render. And to that as well, on the render side, are those table calculations. We talked about this already, is that table calculations are calculated in the query for rendering. Smaller data sets, if you're working with table calculations, are probably faster than in a level of detail. But just remember, totals are also table calculations. So if you decide, I'm going to include a total, well, that's going to create a table calculation, which is going to be slower. And in general, we already mentioned this, nested table calculations not going to be particularly fast, especially if you get to 2, 3, 4 layers on top of that. Finally, if you really need custom polygons or polygons that are going to be rendered, avoid it if you can. If you need to show a shape of a state or a city or a country or whatever it is, that will slow down performance because it is something that needs to be rendered. But if you don't need it, if it was just something like adds and enhance the understanding, and it could be slowing down your visualization. And frankly, if we're talking about rendering, if there's a way to remove legends, just know that legends are affecting your rendering as well. So if you've got a lot of legends, if you can find a way to pull those out, that works just as well. Last point on rendering, Viz in tooltips. There's two things that you should know. One, if you're using Viz in tooltips, it will slow down performance. They do take a while to render. But if you want to find a fast way to render a particular Viz in tooltip, what I recommend is you use the Viz in tooltip, then you drag onto your Viz, even if it's not being used somewhere on your dashboard, you drag on the actual sheet that you are going to Viz in tooltips, but might not be active, and you size it to about 1 pixel by 1 pixel, and you just set it off to the side on your Viz so it really can't be seen. It'll actually improve the render time for it because Tableau is going to do the query ahead of time, and it just speeds up that whole process. Just remember though, as we wrap up here, when it comes down to it, 95% of the time, your dashboard is due to an accumulation of bad decisions, whether it was nested table calculations, the design of your data, putting on too many points onto your visual, too many sheets. All of those things can slow down and make a dashboard feel slow. If you're really looking for performance, use extracts. They will almost always improve performance. Next point to bring up, just keep your data in general organized, keep your worksheets organized. These aren't things that will improve performance per se. They will help keep you organized and you track down where those slowdowns might occur. Avoid drill downs and filters, like if you can, the fewest number as possible. Same thing with marks, fewest number as possible. And then finally, if I'm going to remind you of one thing, is that Boolean calculations are faster than number calculations, which are faster than string calculations, which are faster than date calculations. So if you can skip your way around values here to optimize towards certain things, try to get things in Boolean form. They'll always be faster. So that said, that's it. That's my entire presentation here. Hopefully you'll find some of these tips to be extremely useful for improving the performance of your workbooks using some insights. All of these, by the way, drawn from Tableau's white paper, version 10 of all things white paper. Hasn't really changed too much since then, but more or less that's exactly how it would operate. Anyway, thank you for attending this session. So that is this session. Really again, appreciate you for attending today. If you really want to get a hold of me, anything, luke.stanke@tessellationconsulting.com. I'm on Twitter at Luke Stanke, and you can always feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Again, linkedin.com/in/Luke Stanke. Happy to connect and discuss anything that has been brought up here today. Thanks again. I'll see you next time in my next session.